running through every fertile forest are watercourses that flow like the lifeblood of the land. In fact, for many organisms, these little brooks and streams and rivers are the cradle where life begins. And so often I find myself hovering along their banks and sometimes walking through them, taking time to study their details and learn about the life that dwells within their clear waters. Not just the fishes that dwell in the water, nor the aquatic birds, but the simpler organisms, the algae, bacteria and fungi, and the tiny crustaceans that live on them. These organisms are, in fact, the foundation of the food web, and essential to the transference of basic energy from the simplest of organisms up the trophic scale to larger land-dwelling organisms, including us. Water falls from the sky as rain, and as it flows into the channels of watercourses, it carries with it leafy detritus, bits of topsoil, and the decaying animal and plant matter over which it flows. And once it actually reaches the banks of a watercourse, its even more powerful, brisk flow churns the banks and bottoms of those watercourses, stirring up even more sediment, more nutrient. You can see bits of it flowing quickly past, here in the little river deep in an old hemlock forest where I was filming. And even though this river is remote and clear, a great deal of particulate matter is flowing by. These particles form the nutrient source which feeds one of the most basic levels of the food web. That is, the biofilms that grow in underwater rocks, which may be found in any healthy watercourse. Today we're going to learn about biofilms and examine a recent paper, The Dark Side of Rocks, an underestimated high-quality food resource in river ecosystems, written by Fen Guo, Stuart E. Bunn, Michael T. Brett, Hans Hager, and Martin J. Kainz, which appeared not too long ago in the Journal of Ecology, which is published by the British Ecological Society. According to the science section of Wikipedia, biofilms are defined as entrophic consortiums of microorganisms in which cells stick to each other and also, often to a surface. These adherent cells become embedded within a slimy extracellular matrix that is composed of extracellular polymeric substances, EPSs. The cells within the biofilm produce the EPS components, which are typically a polymeric conglomeration of extracellular polysaccharides, proteins, lipids, and DNA. Because they have three-dimensional structure and represent a community lifestyle for microorganisms, they have been metaphorically described as cities for microbes. Alright, let's put that into English. So, biofilms are mixed-up masses of fungi, protozoa, bacteria, archaea, and algae. They live in the slime they create around them, the EPS, which in its way houses them. And if you've ever been paddling over a brook or walked over a stream or a river, or even canoed across a lake, you've undoubtedly noticed some stones or logs that were covered in slime. Very often, that's biofilm. In some circumstances, biofilm can be almost invisible. After all, it's comprised of microscopic organisms, and those microscopic organisms have to be successful enough, that is to say, have enough opportunity to gather food and grow, so that they can build up their numbers and biomass enough that they can be seen with the naked eye. But in many brooks and rivers, if you reach down and feel the stones, you'll notice they feel a little bit slimy, even though you might not be able to see anything on them. And that's because they have a thin coating of biofilms on them. Now, these biofilms form the basis of the trophic systems of rivers and brooks, and even lakes. That is to say, they're at the bottom of the food chain. Even though we don't really use the concept of food chain anymore, it's been replaced by food web. But they are a foundational food source for small organisms that live within rivers and brooks, such as tiny crustaceans, like these. Small crustaceans and other small creatures eat the biofilms, and they in turn are eaten by larger creatures, which eventually are eaten by things such as amphibians, frogs and salamanders for example, snails, and even small fish, which of course in turn are eaten by larger things. And so it goes. Thus we see that the nutrition which is created at the level of the biofilms is carried up the food web to larger and larger organisms. As we touched upon earlier, these biofilms receive their nutrients from the detritus which is washed down into the watercourses by way of rain and stirred up by the flowage of the water. The nutrients in that detritus come from those washed up in the soil itself, and from nutrients locked in the decaying matter of animals and plants and fungi that have been washed into the rivers and brooks. Now, all of this was known, but the authors of the paper note that there is a difference in the nutrition to be found on the biofilms on the bright side of stones versus the biofilms to be found on the dark side of river and brook stones. They discovered this when they sent a research team to subalpine regions of the river Ybbs, which is found in Austria. There they took samples from 8 riffles, that is shallows where water washes over stone. They gathered stones and the invertebrates to be found on those stones. They studied the biofilm itself as well as the composition of the invertebrates. And they found that light biofilms contained a higher proportion of algal fatty acid, while the dark biofilms, those biofilms that grow on the underside of brook and river stones, contain greater proportions of bacterial fatty acids, oleic acid, and long-chain saturated fatty acids. It's noteworthy that the long-chain fatty acids are biomarkers of terrestrial plants, a clue to how dark biofilms get nutrient. And they found that the crustaceans in their study were very reliant on the fatty acids to be found specifically on the dark biofilms. Now, this might sound like the kind of boring research that only a scientist who specializes in this sort of thing would find fascinating. It may, after all, seem highly esoteric, and who really wants to think of slimes in rivers and brooks? But their research found that these dark biofilms comprised a heretofore unrecognized source of nutrition at the very basis of the food chain. And in alpine and subalpine regions, and into the far northern and southern regions where it's cold, these dark slimes may be even more important, because the watercourses in those regions are fairly nutrient poor. And this means those biofilms which are on the underside of stones are especially important as a food source, not just for the life that dwells in the rivers, but for all the layers of life further up the trophic system that relies on the crustaceans and other small critters that eat those dark biofilms. Now, the light biofilms obtain much of their energy through photosynthesis. They gather the particles and nutrients in the water, and they process it into energy, using their chlorophyll. But the dark biofilms don't have the advantage of light, so they gather their energy through heterotrophy. That is to say, they digest it in the way of animals, or fungi. They break down basic food created by plants into energy for their own use. And the researchers found there is even evidence that there is an exchange of nutrients between the biofilm to be found on the light side of stones and the biofilm to be found on the dark sides, in a sense making each stone coated in biofilm its own ecosystem. Ultimately, the nutrients, especially the fatty acids to be found on the dark side of biofilms, work their way out of the rivers and brooks back to the animals that live upon the land, making these dark biofilms an important nutrient resource that was heretofore overlooked. And they found that the invertebrates, such as the small crustaceans that dwelled in these river and brook ecosystems, were especially reliant on the nutrient to be found in the dark biofilms. However, since so many creatures up the trophic scale, from small fish to larger fish to mammals and birds, rely ultimately on those crustaceans being eaten and their nutrients passing up the food chain, if the growth of those crustaceans is inhibited, it can form a basic risk to alpine, subalpine, and far northern and southern ecosystems. Sadly, as is so often the case these days, the ability of rivers and brooks to nourish these dark biofilms is increasingly threatened by human activities. As surrounding forests and woodlands are cut down, and lands are contaminated with toxins, such as the pesticides used in so much forestry and farming, the delicate microorganisms that comprise these biofilms may be damaged. And the authors note that it is important to take time to study the impacts of human activity on them. I think ultimately the recent discovery of the unique nutritional importance of dark biofilms in the trophic system is yet another reminder of just how little we understand of the natural world, and an indicator that we should slow down, applying foremost the precautionary principle before we act, in order to protect the ecosystems upon which the health of our world and ourselves is ultimately dependent. Thank you for watching. The Naturalist program is committed to the reliable coverage of natural science and environmental issues. If you like our program, please take a moment to subscribe and like.
Autumn leaves are turning brown, branches bare.